Ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully, because what is unfolding right now is not noise, not routine volatility, not just another cycle that you can afford to ignore. This is a shift, a structural shift. And if you are holding silver without understanding what is happening beneath the surface, then you are standing in the path of something you cannot control. This is not about profit anymore. This is about survival. The kind of survival that demands awareness, discipline, and above all, action before the window closes. The world you think you understand. The predictable rhythm of markets. The belief that assets move based on simple supply and demand, the assumption that time is always on your side, is no longer the world you are operating in. What you are facing now is a system under pressure. Not visible pressure. Not the kind that makes headlines immediately, but internal stress building quietly, silently, like cracks forming beneath a structure that still appears intact from the outside. Before you go any further, like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and the current time in your country. Now, let's get back to the topic. Most people will not see it. That is the nature of systemic risk. It does not announce itself. It does not send invitations. It builds in layers, debt stacked upon debt, leverage multiplied across institutions, obligations intertwined so deeply that no one fully understands where the fault lines truly lie. And yet, despite this complexity, one truth remains simple. When the system begins to fail, it does not fail in isolation. It fails all at once. You have to understand what that means. This is not about one market dropping or one asset declining. This is about the possibility that multiple parts of the financial system begin to seize simultaneously. Liquidity disappears. Prices disconnect from reality. Access becomes restricted. And in that moment, it does not matter what you thought you owned. What matters is what you can control, what you can access, and how quickly you can respond. Silver holders often believe they are insulated. They believe that by holding a tangible asset, they are protected from the chaos of financial markets. And under normal conditions, that belief has some merit. But what happens when conditions are no longer normal? What happens when the system itself becomes unstable? In a systemic event, the rules change. Liquidity becomes the most valuable asset in the world, and everything else is judged by how easily it can be converted, accessed, or utilized. Silver, despite its intrinsic value, is not immune to this reality. In fact, it becomes part of the problem if you are not prepared. Think about this carefully. If markets freeze, if exchanges become unstable, if logistics are disrupted, if buyers disappear temporarily, or spreads widen dramatically, then your ability to act becomes constrained. You may hold value, but you may not be able to realize it when you need to. And in a crisis, timing is everything. Delays are not inconveniences, they are losses. The danger lies in the illusion of stability. Right now, many look at the markets and see movement, but not collapse. They see fluctuations, but not failure, and that creates complacency. But beneath that surface, leverage continues to expand. Financial institutions continue to operate with minimal buffers. Complex instruments continue to grow in scale and opacity. This is not speculation. It is structural reality. Leverage amplifies everything. It magnifies gains during stability, but it also magnifies losses during stress. When assets begin to decline, leveraged positions are forced to unwind. That means selling, and not controlled selling, forced selling. Liquidations that cascade through the system, pushing prices lower, triggering more liquidations, creating a chain reaction that feeds on itself. Now add derivatives to this equation. Contracts layered upon contracts, obligations tied to counterparties across the globe. These instruments are designed to manage risk, but they also concentrate it. When one link in that chain breaks, the impact does not stay contained. It spreads, rapidly, unpredictably, and often irreversibly. This is where most investors fail to grasp the scale of the problem. They think in terms of individual assets, individual markets. But the system does not operate that way anymore. It is interconnected, highly interconnected. A shock in one area can transmit across the entire network within hours. And when that transmission begins, confidence is the first casualty. Markets are built on trust. Trust that contracts will be honored. Trust that liquidity will be available. Trust that institutions will function. When that trust begins to erode, behavior changes instantly. Participants withdraw, risk is avoided at all costs. Capital stops flowing, and without flow, the system begins to seize. For silver holders, this creates a paradox. On one hand, silver is seen as a safe haven. On the other hand, in a liquidity crisis, safe havens can become temporarily illiquid. Prices can become distorted. Access can become limited. And those who assumed they were protected may find themselves unable to act when it matters most. This is not about whether silver has value. It does. The question is whether you can navigate the system that surrounds it, because that system is not designed for your convenience. It is designed for control. Control exists in ways most people never see. It exists in how prices are formed, how markets react, how information is distributed. The price you see is not just a reflection of physical demand. It is influenced by positioning, by volume, by strategic actions taken by participants with far greater resources and reach. Large players do not react to the market, they shape it. They understand how to move sentiment, how to create pressure, how to exploit behavior. They know that most participants are reactive, not proactive. They know that fear and greed drive decisions, and they position themselves accordingly. This is where the average holder becomes vulnerable, not because they lack intelligence, but because they operate with incomplete information. They see price movements, but not the forces behind them. They react to changes, but do not anticipate them. And in a controlled environment, reaction is always too late. Consider how easily perception can be manipulated. A sudden surge in selling creates panic. A rapid rise creates euphoria. Both are opportunities for those who understand the mechanics behind the movement. Volume can be used to create illusions. Strategic timing can amplify emotional responses. And once the crowd reacts, the outcome becomes predictable. This is not random, it is structured. Silver markets, in particular, are deeply influenced by these dynamics. Paper markets, derivatives, and leveraged positions all interact to create price signals that may not reflect physical reality. And yet, those signals drive behavior. They influence decisions. They determine entry and exit points for millions of participants. Now combine this with systemic risk, and the picture becomes clear. You are not just dealing with a volatile asset. You are dealing with a volatile system. And within that system, timing becomes the single most critical factor. You can be right about everything. The direction, the fundamentals, the long-term value, and still lose if your timing is wrong. Acting too early can trap you. Acting too late can destroy you. And waiting for certainty often means missing the only window that matters. Markets move in phases. Quiet accumulation, gradual shifts, sudden acceleration, and then collapse, or breakout. The transition between these phases is where opportunity and risk are at their highest. And that transition is rarely obvious until it has already begun. This is why preparation matters more than prediction. You do not need to know exactly when the shift will occur. You need to recognize when the conditions are aligning. Rising stress, increasing volatility, unusual behavior. These are signals, not guarantees, but warnings. And warnings are only useful if you act on them. Most will not. Most will wait. They will seek confirmation. They will look for reassurance. And by the time they receive it, the opportunity to act will be gone. Because in a system under pressure, change does not happen gradually. It happens suddenly. And when it does, there is no time to think. Only time to act. This is where discipline separates those who survive from those who do not. The ability to act without hesitation. To follow a plan. To prioritize protection over emotion. Because make no mistake, emotion is the greatest enemy in a crisis. Fear will tell you to sell at the worst possible moment. Greed will tell you to hold when you should exit. And hesitation will keep you frozen while the system moves around you. You must understand this. Internalize it, because when the moment comes, you will not have the luxury of analysis. You will only have your preparation. And that preparation begins now. Not when headlines appear. Not when prices collapse. Not when everyone else starts reacting. Now, because the system is already under stress. The signals are already present. The only question is whether you are paying attention. And if you are, then you already know, this is not a game of waiting. It is a game of positioning. It is a game of timing. And most importantly, it is a game of survival. What comes next is where most people fail. Not because they lack awareness, but because they lack a plan. Awareness without action is useless. Knowing the risk exists does not protect you from it. Understanding manipulation does not shield you from its effects. Recognizing timing does not guarantee you will act correctly when the moment arrives. Protection requires structure. It requires decisions made in advance, not in the chaos of a collapsing environment. You have to start by accepting a difficult truth. There is no perfect position. There is no asset that is immune. There is no strategy that eliminates risk completely. What exists instead is a spectrum of outcomes, and your goal is to position yourself where the damage is limited and the flexibility remains intact. Because in a crisis, flexibility is power. The first layer of protection is exposure control. Too many make the mistake of concentrating entirely in one idea, one asset, one belief. That is not conviction, that is vulnerability. When everything depends on a single outcome, you lose the ability to adapt. And in a dynamic system, the inability to adapt is fatal. You must think in terms of balance, not blind diversification, but intentional distribution. Every position should have a purpose. Every allocation should answer a question. What role does this play if conditions deteriorate? If you cannot answer that clearly, then you are not managing risk, you are guessing. Liquidity must be at the center of your thinking. Not theoretical liquidity, not the assumption that you can sell when you want, but real, accessible liquidity. In stable markets, liquidity is abundant. Buyers exist. Spreads are tight. Transactions are smooth. But when stress enters the system, liquidity vanishes faster than most people can comprehend. This is where many silver holders are caught off guard. They assume that because silver has value, it will always be easy to convert. But conversion depends on counterparties, on functioning markets, on logistics that can break down under pressure. If demand surges in one moment and disappears in another, if premiums widen unpredictably, if delivery delays emerge, then your ability to act becomes uncertain. And uncertainty is risk. You must structure your holdings in a way that accounts for this. Not everything should be locked. Not everything should be illiquid. There must be layers, assets that can be accessed immediately, assets that can be converted quickly, and assets that are held for long-term preservation. Without this structure, you are exposed to timing risk that you cannot control. Then comes the question of counterparty exposure. Many assume that as long as they hold something of value, they are safe. But value tied to a counterparty is not the same as value in your control. If access depends on someone else's ability to deliver, to honor, to function, then you are exposed to their failure. In stable conditions, this risk feels distant. In stressed conditions, it becomes immediate. You must evaluate where your assets are, who controls access, and what happens if that access is disrupted. This is not paranoia, this is preparation. Systems fail in ways that are not always predictable, but the vulnerabilities are always there. Hedging is another layer, but it is often misunderstood. Hedging is not about eliminating risk entirely. It is about shaping it. It is about creating offsets that reduce the impact of adverse moves. But hedging comes with cost, with complexity, and with its own set of risks. Used incorrectly, it can create more exposure, not less. Used correctly, it provides stability when everything else becomes unstable. The key is alignment. Your protective measures must match the risks you are facing. Not generic strategies, not copied approaches, but tailored decisions based on your exposure, your timing, and your objectives. Without alignment, protection becomes illusion. Monitoring is continuous. There is no set-and-forget approach in an environment like this. Conditions evolve, signals change. What was safe yesterday may not be safe tomorrow. You must remain engaged, not obsessively reactive, but consistently aware. Watch for shifts in behavior, not just price. Sudden spikes in volatility, unusual movements, dislocations between markets, changes in liquidity conditions. These are indicators that something beneath the surface is changing, and when those signals align, you must be ready to act. But action requires predefined triggers. If you wait to decide in the moment, you will hesitate. And hesitation is where losses multiply. You must know in advance what conditions require a response. At what point do you reduce exposure? At what point do you increase liquidity? At what point do you step aside completely? These decisions should not be emotional. They should be structural. Because when the system begins to move, it moves fast. Behavioral discipline is the final and perhaps most critical component. You can have the perfect strategy, the ideal positioning, the clearest signals, and still fail if you cannot control your reactions. The human mind is not built for crisis environments. It seeks comfort. It seeks confirmation. It resists action when action feels uncomfortable. And in markets, the correct decision is often the one that feels the worst in the moment. Selling when everything appears stable. Acting when others are complacent. Stepping aside when the crowd is confident. These actions go against instinct. But instinct, in this environment, is a liability. You must rely on structure, not feeling. And then there is the issue of physical security. Holding silver is not just a financial decision, it is a logistical one. Storage, verification, accessibility, these are not secondary concerns. They are central to the effectiveness of your position. If your holdings are secure but inaccessible, they do not serve you. If they are accessible but vulnerable, they create another form of risk. Balance must exist here as well. Multiple layers, redundancy, contingency planning. Because disruption does not follow convenience. Extreme scenarios must be considered, not because they are guaranteed, but because they are possible. Market closures, transaction delays, currency instability, supply chain interruptions. These are not theoretical in a stressed system. They are outcomes that have occurred before and can occur again. Preparation for extremes does not mean expecting collapse at every moment. It means ensuring that if conditions deteriorate rapidly, you are not caught without options. And options are everything. Because the ultimate goal is not just to survive the disruption, but to remain capable of acting when others cannot. When the system constrains movement, those with flexibility gain advantage. When others are forced to react, those prepared can choose. That is the difference. This is why waiting is dangerous. Waiting assumes the stability. Waiting assumes that you will have time. Waiting assumes that the system will give you a clear signal before it shifts. It will not. The shift, when it comes, will feel sudden. Even if the signs were there all along, even if the buildup was visible, the transition itself will be fast. And in that speed, decisions will be compressed into moments. You cannot build a strategy in those moments. You either have it or you do not. And if you do not, then you are at the mercy of forces you cannot influence. So ask yourself the only question that matters. If conditions change tomorrow, are you ready? Not theoretically ready, not conceptually prepared, actually ready. Can you access what you need? Can you move when required? Can you protect what you have? Can you act without hesitation? If the answer to any of those is uncertain, then you are exposed. And exposure in this environment is not something you can afford. Because this is not about predicting the exact outcome. It is about preparing for the range of outcomes. It is about ensuring that no single event, no sudden shift, no systemic failure can completely remove your ability to respond. Control what you can, reduce what you cannot, maintain flexibility at all times. That is the strategy, and it must be implemented before the pressure becomes visible to everyone else. Because once it does, the advantage is gone. Once everyone sees the risk, it is already too late to avoid it. That is how these systems work. Quiet until they are not. Stable until they break. Predictable until they move all at once. And when they do, only those who prepared in advance remain in control. Everyone else is reacting. Everyone else is trying to catch up. Everyone else is forced into decisions they did not plan for. Do not be in that position. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not rely on assumptions. Act based on structure, not emotion. Because the system does not reward hesitation, it punishes it. And in a market like this, punishment is permanent. The window is not infinite. The opportunity to position, to protect, to prepare, it exists now, but it will not exist forever. Every moment you delay, the margin for action narrows. Every assumption you make increases your vulnerability. Every hesitation moves you closer to being trapped. This is the reality you are facing. Not fear, not exaggeration, but structure. A system under pressure. A market influenced by forces beyond visibility. A timeline that does not wait for your comfort. And a decision that only you can make. Move early or react late. Prepare now or be forced later. Maintain control or lose it when it matters most. Because when the shift comes, and it will not ask if you are ready. It will simply move, and your position at that moment will determine everything. So take this seriously. Not tomorrow, not later. Now. Because this is not just about silver. This is about whether you are prepared to navigate what comes next. And whether you will still have the ability to act when everyone else no longer can. Make your decision before the system makes it for you. Because once that happens, there is no negotiation, only consequences. And they arrive faster than most are prepared to handle. Act accordingly. In the end, the message is simple. Even if the situation is not, do not confuse holding an asset with being protected. Do not confuse awareness with readiness. And do not confuse time with safety. The window to act is always before the crisis, never during it. What you do now determines whether you remain in control or become part of the reaction. The system will shift when it is ready, not when you are. So prepare, reposition, and act with clarity while you still have the advantage. Because once that advantage disappears, it does not come back.